Ladies and gentlemen, the next session is Strengthening the Detroit Region's Hometown Talent Pipeline. Joining David Dobson, please welcome Executive Director for the Education Trust Midwest, Amber Arellano, Global Director of Talent Acquisition of General Motors, William Huffaker, and to moderate the discussion, Executive Director for the Michigan College Access Network, Brandy Johnson.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. Good morning.
Hello, how
Excellent
are you?
job.
Hi.
Thank you.
See.
Good morning, and thank you so much to the Chamber for inviting me to moderate the panel. My name is Brandy Johnson. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the Michigan College Access Network. We work at a statewide level based in Lansing to increase college readiness, enrollment, and completion in Michigan, particularly among low-income students, first-generation college-going students, and students of color. We define college as post-secondary educational attainment, similar to Detroit Drive's degrees, looking to help individuals get technical certificates, associate degrees, bachelor's degrees, and beyond. We know that college is a necessity, a prerequisite to our economy, no longer a luxury. We know that college is for everyone, or it should be, and we need to eliminate the large gaps we see in attainment rates between subgroups. But we also know that college is a public good. Not only will it help individuals with upward mobility, but it will also make our state and our regions much more prosperous. The primary strategy that MCAN has been working on over the last 5 years or so has been truly infrastructure development. We work with 31 or so communities across the state to help develop coalitions or networks of high-level leaders from K-12, higher ed, business, philanthropy, the nonprofit sector, and our elected officials, create that shared vision for dramatic increases in post-secondary educational attainment. And together, those coalitions start to tackle the changes to systems, policies, and practices in order to make those needle-moving changes that we want and to really align resources. Just not so far from here is St. Clair County, which is a county we've been working in from the very beginning. They also operate as a regional collaborative and have decided that they needed to dramatically increase their post-secondary educational attainment rates in order to meet the labor market demands of their county and to increase things like per capita income. They also knew that there was much inequity across school districts within the county, with Port Huron High School being the one where students of color predominantly attended and where it was the only high school in the county that actually had a below 50% college going rate. So over 5 years, they worked intentionally, collaboratively, and aggressively to increase college readiness and enrollment rates. Not only did they increase each district's enrollment rate by a little, making the region increase, so rising tides lifted all boats, but they paid particular attention to Port Huron High School, and by the end of the 5 years, the college going rate of Port Huron High School was within 1 percentage point of their highest income high school in Marysville. So it's just a great example, and it's been my pleasure to work with the Chamber and with Detroit Drive's degrees on their leadership council as this infrastructure starts to develop. So just a little context setting. So my first question is for Amber. So Amber, we obviously know that higher education attainment is critical to economic and social mobility. We know that we need to make sure that that first year in the engineering graphic is to make sure our students are prepared to earn a post-secondary credential. So from your perspective and based on the work that you've done at EdTrust Midwest, are we adequately preparing our students to go into that next year of post-secondary education? Are we doing that well, and are we doing that equitably?
Well, first I want to say thank you so much for having me today, and what an amazing talk. Thank you so much. That was incredibly inspiring, and I think really important for setting the context for our conversation today. So I think I don't have to tell you that, no, we're not, Detroit is not preparing students to be successful by and large. We now know based on the national assessment that Detroit is in the bottom of all urban school districts in the country for student achievement. And our charter sector is among the lowest performing charter sectors in the country. And I think for many of us who came here through our mobility stories, as I did, like many of you, I'm sure, that the story was in Michigan and Metro Detroit, really we're doing pretty well as a state in education, except for the Detroit public schools. If we could just get that mess cleaned up, everything would be fine. And I think what we've been learning in the last 5 years is that the things like systems and design, from the state level to the regional level down to the school level down, is having a really big impact on places like Detroit. And we've had this mindset in Michigan that the schools themselves are kind of, like personal heroism, that schools themselves have to somehow pull themselves up for their bootstraps and be these unique school stories to make their schools do things that are near impossible, and they're often fighting tsunamis going against them. And I say that because if you think, just to give you an example of how our state and local systems really work against excellence in preparing students to be college and career ready. When you think about what great systems, and at the heart of those systems look like around public education and is equity, is a state like Massachusetts. And about 25 years ago, Massachusetts was actually underperforming Michigan on most metrics like 8th grade math, a really important predictor for college success, 3rd grade reading, not only a predictor of college success, but a predictor of long-term employment success, a predictor of whether a child will do jail time as a teenager, a predictor whether a young woman will become pregnant as a teenager. So really important predictors. And at that time, in the early 90s, Michigan and Massachusetts were about the same in many of those metrics. And around that time, Massachusetts, much as we've gone through in the last 10 to 15 years, kind of went through an early identity crisis. Their textile industry had been declining for decades. Places like Lowell, Massachusetts looked a lot like my hometown, Pontiac, right? And had lost all of its factories and was really, many communities were really trying to figure out what are we going to do next. And the leaders, led really by business in the state, said, the future is going to be about talent. And we really don't have a world-class education system, and how are we going to get there? And there was a grand bargain between Democrats and Republicans, between K-12 and business, that really established a whole new set of systems that not only propelled Massachusetts to become not only the tops in the country for educational achievement, but also now, if it was its own country, number 6 in the world for educational attainment and achievement. And so that happened in about 15 years, which is really extraordinary when you think about it. What that means is today, by 4th grade, an African-American low-income student in Boston, by 4th grade, is 3 years ahead in instruction, right, in academic learning, than a low-income African-American student in Detroit. By 4th grade, those kids are 3 years ahead, right? And think about the cumulative effect of that over time, right? We know that if a child is not reading by 4th grade, they're already on track to drop out of high school, not go on for a post-secondary degree, and never go get a bachelor's degree, which is what we're talking about here. So the systems from, college and career readiness starts before birth, as we all know, right? But what they did was that they said, we're not going to say to schools, which is what Michigan often does, you're kind of on your own. We're not going to say to districts, you have to figure it out. What they did was that they built very intentional systems based on the levers that we know really matter. Things like building a really high caliber, high quality workforce, figuring out a new public funding system that put remarkably more dollars in low income schools. But business insisted that, if we're going to say we're going to quadruple down our investment in K-12, we're not going to do that with no strings attached. We're going to build really high performance standards. We're going to hold teachers to them. We're going to evaluate against those standards. We're going to create a data-driven accountability system, right? We're going to create urgency and be really honest about how we're doing against those systems and grade schools, and put that data out there on an annual basis to hold our feet to the fire and to hold parents to the fire, because that helped create urgency for parents and stakeholders, and to let educators know, here's how you're doing against those benchmarks. So they created these very intentional strategic systems with equity at the heart of them. And our systems in Michigan, not only do we not have those quality systems that are focused on excellence, they're not about equity whatsoever. We're in the bottom 10 states of the country for the gap between what we fund high poverty schools and what we fund affluent schools. We from the very start, we create huge barriers for those schools for academic success. We're in the top 10 states for what we pay teachers, which is really important, right? When we think about talent, education systems have to have great talent. The quality of a teacher in a child's classroom is one of the most important predictors of that child's student achievement. We all know, right, from our own experiences, great teachers can overcome a lot of odds, and thank God they do. I mean, that's a big part of my mobility story. But we also know that we can't ask teachers to be martyrs. We can't ask them to make $30,000 less by staying in a school in Detroit instead of moving on to a school in Troy once they get a few years of experience. And any of us that came out of an education school, as I did at Michigan State more than 20 years ago, recruiters and the schools the districts that can afford to pay talent, they are tracking talent. And they are really good about building those talent systems.
So Amber, is there anything underway in Lansing that is promising to get us on a track more like that of Massachusetts from using policy levers?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're at the beginning of a serious conversation about some of those systems. We've been really happy to be working with a large coalition of statewide organizations, including the Detroit Regional Chamber, Business Leaders for Michigan, the Grand Rapids Chamber, MCAN, and then many civil rights organizations that you wouldn't necessarily think about being at the table. Black Family Development in Detroit, the Michigan NAACP, the Grand Rapids Urban League are among those organizations. And what we've begun to do is really sit down since last summer and begin to think about what equity-driven systemic systems and what design looks like around things like accountability, around fairer school funding, around these kind of public reporting and thoughtful data systems that can help and drive instruction and also create urgency in communities to help people understand how we're doing against national benchmarks. Not what we've done in Michigan for the last 20 years, not comparing ourselves to one another, because when you're 49th in the country for third grade reading, and the state tells everyone we're doing just fine, that doesn't create urgency and it doesn't create more transparency. I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities over the next year, legislatively and in policy, to really put those systems into place. And it's really important that many voices, including voices in the business community, are really at the table and helping participate to ensure that those new systems are focused on excellence and equity. And not, the way that we've traditionally done it in Michigan, setting really low benchmarks, having really low quality standards, and then creating public systems that don't create urgency, in fact, do just the opposite, send the message to both parents and stakeholders, we're doing really well. We just can keep comparing ourselves to each other. And when you're in the bottom in the country for student achievement, it's a really low bar. So happy to share more about that if people are interested.
So let's move on to Bill. We heard a lot about the supply side of talent. Let's talk a little bit about the demand. So given your perspective and your work with GM, how are we doing in providing the talent to meet the demand of the employers, particularly in Metro Detroit?
Great. And good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me today, and thanks for your comments. I'm honored to be here. My job at GM is to look after recruitment around the world, and GM is a big consumer of talent. Last year alone, we hired about 19,000 people around the world, and within the past 4 years, we've created 14,000 new jobs in the United States, all of which are above the median pay grade. So we've done a really, I think, we're winning as an organization, and I think in giving back to the community, but the talent pipeline picture really isn't pretty. We hire, particularly when you kind of double click into our talent needs around STEM talent, we hire a person with a STEM background every 26 seconds. And last year I pulled the data and I did a search. I didn't do it personally, I shouldn't say I, my team. 7,500 engineering jobs open in the Detroit MSA area for engineering. So we're sort of competing for talent with that. And then it gets even scarier when we really want to do more to around social justice and really amp up our efforts around diversity. So I think we're doing better with representation of women, but not necessarily with other representative segments of the workforce. And it's interesting, talent is becoming our constraint, not capital. And when you said, I bristled a little bit, when you said we're sort of the consumers or we're lower in the talent supply chain, if we're going to solve this problem, we have to move from just being a consumer of this talent to being part of that ecosystem of producing talent, because we're not getting what we need. And I know I work in a corporation, but it's not just for the corporation's health, it's also the right thing to do. And I think that more enlightened corporations, I think, have kind of dipped their toe more into this kind of notion of driving social change in our society. And I think that you're seeing companies, stand up more and do more around that. In at least in my opinion, the past 10 to 20 years, they haven't.
So going deeper into that, and you're going to hear a lot more about Detroit Drives Degrees in a bit, but they're working to build new partnerships with the employer community, with education, with nonprofit organizations, philanthropy, elected officials, et cetera. So what is the optimal role for employers?
It's a good question, because I feel like we're part of a lot of initiatives. So the person on my team is part of Secretary of Labor's workforce development. We're involved in Lansing. We're involved in the Detroit Public School System. We're involved with the Community College Alliance and various things. We work very closely with Ford and other organizations. I don't know if we've really figured that out yet. It's not just writing checks. So I spent a fair amount of time in Germany, one of our large manufacturing sites. There are really interesting things that Europe does around apprenticeship program. And I like your idea of how do we encourage people. It's a little hard. It's that personal resilience you have to get through your 4-year degree. And I remember those days coming from a lower socioeconomic status myself, where it's like, build a stay in school, it'll pay off, someday you'll make a paycheck and be able to earn a good living or whatever. But giving people a taste of success, and then having opportunities to maybe expand our internship programs and co-ops and things is really important. So backing up in the supply chain and giving more opportunity. We do that now, but I think we just kind of dabble. We have, I saw Shelley, we have Challenge Detroit, we have a lot of programs we're involved in, but I think that we could be much more systemic and intentional about it. And I don't know if we've figured that out. We get a lot of requests, and I don't know what the highest, best use of our resources would be, just to be completely honest and transparent.
So now moving to David, you've worked nationally, you've worked with many cities and other metro areas. Your data referenced several of them this morning. So what are some of the lessons that we can learn here in Detroit, whether learning from cities that have done really well or cities that have implemented a strategy that we should not embark on?
I won't go there. But, well, first of all, I think what is happening in this room is one of the elements that characterizes communities that are facing reality and trying to engineer solutions. So in my home community, which is Durham, North Carolina, a mill town that now has become a kind of a crucible of medical, pharmaceutical, and electronics engineering and manufacture, the economy shifted without the human capital development systems shifting or leading that transition. So what happened was businesses that used to be able to satisfy their fairly simple talent needs locally, as they evolved, particularly the medical center, pharmaceutical manufacturing, and technology, a culture evolved where businesses said two things. We have a more urgent need for talent than the local system can supply, and therefore we are going to shift to talent recruitment from talent development. That cultural shift created a fundamental disconnect. So we have a tragically bifurcated community where people who are, we have the highest proportion, I think, of PhDs in per capita of any city of our size, and we have 40% of our young people behind or not participating in the economy or in post-secondary education. What we did, and I think this is what you are beginning to do, first of all, we got data to name that problem of a fundamental disconnect, a rupture between people who were stuck and people who were positioned for global success, and the misalignment of the talent development system to actually be able to serve the expectations of these high-performing businesses that had had great success and had evolved a culture of talent recruitment and abandoned a culture of talent development. And the way we did that was to create a table of CEOs, both of major employers and of the onboarding system, criminal justice, all of those ecosystem factors, and young people themselves who had succeeded or were stranded, and began to have a frank conversation. And it took about a year. It took about a year before the head of our Chamber of Commerce at the time finally said, I guess we need to name what's been going on. That about 15 years ago, we concluded talent development in this economy and this set of politics was too time-consuming, and we switched to talent recruitment. And now we see the consequences. So that, I have on my email a quote from James Baldwin that says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." It took us, it took us a year to face what the issue was. We didn't have a talent development system. We had a highly evolved talent recruitment system that was leaving behind people who happened to be born in socially isolated and economically isolated sectors of our community. And we began with this CEO table to replicate the system that would have to be represented in a new design. And that's the work we're engaged in. It is CEO-level systems redesign based on an honest conversation that we had a misalignment in two cultures. The demand culture was sourcing talent almost exclusively outside our community. And the supply system was under the illusion that they were providing the talent that that business needed. And that could happen on the margin, but it wasn't happening deeply with disconnected populations. And so it took a while to create a structure that would model the whole system so that the system could essentially redesign itself. What we are putting an emphasis on to meet the urgency of business and the need for these socially and experientially disconnected young people to get their own clues about what the world of work requires. And that itself is based on an assumption that young people want to succeed. The dominant paradigm we began to get is that there's a group of people who just don't want that's complete nonsense.
Yes.
Young people want to succeed, but they have to know the pathway and they have to know what success is and what it can, what will unlock it. So and it'd be interesting to say, we believe that constructing work-based learning, which is a collaborative engagement of the education system and employers to create meaningful, first, summer experiences that are exposing young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to the rigors in the Duke medical system and in GlaxoSmithKline and in Biogen and in IBM and in Cisco, worlds that they live 5 minutes from and are as foreign as Pluto to these young people. Creating those possibilities, this lights the spark, and then proliferating those models that work. So you can't do everything. That ecosystem cloud is huge. We still have transportation, criminal justice, other problems. But the leverage point of work-based learning, infusing what happens in the classroom and what happens in the workplace into an intentional curriculum design, seemed to us in our environment, and we have a vigorous economy, to be the starting point. But we also complement that with, I would just say, a truth-telling culture of the system heads. And getting to a truth-telling culture is really a problem. One little incident, I told this to people last night. We had a senior judge from the Superior Court at this table, and the chair was the head of the Duke medical system, who is the uber mensch of Durham. Drives everything. And so we'd gotten to know each other, and the judge, and first African-American female judge elected in Durham, finally says, well, we've been together. I think we should be able to talk honestly. And I want to say to the chairman of the Duke Health System that I want to thank the Duke Health System for making me a judge today. And I said to myself, this is not going to be good. There's something lurking here. And the head of the health system, who's a wonderful man, said, well, tell me, Judge O'Neill, how this happened. He said, well, I graduated from the HBCU in Durham, magna cum laude, and like so many other people, I walked across town to the Duke Hospital, the big employer, and met with HR, and they said, well, Miss O'Neill, you've got an impressive background, and perhaps with luck in 10 years, you could be a very good executive secretary. And she said, so I sucked it in, and I didn't say anything. I thanked the person. I got up, I marched back across town, enrolled in law school, and today I'm a judge. So thank you, Duke Medical. Well, you can imagine, and to his credit, the head of Duke Health said, why on earth are we pushing away talent through our own internal practices? I had no idea. And how many other people come with potential, appetite, energy, and credentials that can be built upon, and we are throwing them away? I mean, so that was a moment of that was the truth-telling. And I do think the point I was trying to make there is, along with the engineering, which is the technical work, it is this cultural kind of repositioning that's really essential. And last thing, Peter Drucker, if he didn't say it, he's quoted as saying, culture will eat strategy for breakfast. We can put in place all of these pathways and still have someone turning away Judge O'Neill, who's done everything right, and then gets to the decision point. So the only way we can do this is to have people who have decision-making authority, I think, see themselves as part of the same system that is trying to advance the same goals. And that is happening in places around the country and in very hopeful kind of green shoot signs, and it's happening here.
Bill, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I could not agree more with what you're saying, but just to add, I think the build versus buy talent debate is always active, and in a corporation that has to move very quickly, and it's convenient to blame Wall Street, but when you are managing to your stock price and quarterly profits and things, that build proposition takes much longer and is more expensive. It really does. So you're right, it's convenient for us just to go out and acquire talent and then just write a check, knowing that maybe they'll stay with us 3 to 5 years. And so the ecosystem of companies and how they're developing people through different jobs is a double-edged sword. And the other thing is, it's interesting how companies back in the day, we had GM University, and we had Kettering and things, so we actually have rich historical examples of where we were part of the ecosystem. And then when GM went through those dark days, a lot of that was sort of shed. And I think I would hope that we can learn from those things. The final part I'll make is our CEO often says our company is changing in the next 5 years than it did in the past 50. So when you have driverless cars, I was in Israel last fall, and it was really interesting. We hired an ophthalmologist, a PhD ophthalmologist, to look at lenses to sense, things on the car, to drive itself. We never would have hired an ophthalmologist in the past. So even the skill sets we need, it assumes that we kind of know what the hell we need sometimes, and we don't. Beyond just, trust me, beyond maybe just a year. So it's very much a moving target. So I'm just saying, I do think corporations should be part of the solution. It's also convenient to demonize corporations, and they're under system constraints as well that are suboptimal too. But anything that we can do to get beyond nice conferences and panel discussions to actually do some heavy lifting and looking at systemic solutions, I think that's what we should be doing.
Can I jump here?
Yeah.
I think that's a great point, in that given the how quickly things are changing, that you said you only know what you know maybe a year out what you're going to need in terms of talent. And it worries us a lot when we hear policymakers saying, we need, 75 welders in Michigan right now. And so, so let's lower our performance standards and our expectations. And this work we've done, we're trying to do in creating more equitable systems focused on excellence, because we need 50 welders right now. And so saying maybe it's okay that kids graduate from high school without knowing how to read, because they're just going to get a job for a welder anyway, right? Whereas that's such a short-term.
The world will pass them by.
Myopic
so will the
view,
company.
right? Exactly, right, exactly, yeah. So, there's a great debate going on right now in Lansing about the Michigan Merit Curriculum. Great example of one of the things that Michigan has really gotten right about system design. Our high school college and career readiness metrics around our ACT, our statewide average ACT scores, even in low-income communities. One of the few metrics that we've actually either stayed still on, which in Michigan in the last 15 years has been progress, or actually improved on. All of the other metrics we've actually plummeted. And a lot of people attribute that to Michigan putting into place in around 2004 the Michigan Merit Curriculum that was really intended to push high schools to create more equitable access to rigorous instruction. Right? It's actually one of the most important things you can do for kids, especially kids of color and low-income students, because so often in those schools there are no AP classes, right? We know based on research that those schools are often staffed with less effective teachers for lots of structural reasons. And so ensuring that all kids have access to high caliber math that prepares kids to succeed in college, to things like Algebra 2, to rich coursework, not only in the social sciences, but also foreign languages. Lots of universities now require that you have 1 or 2 years of a foreign language. There are bills on the table right now that are gutting all of that and trying to replace, things like coding, foreign languages with things like coding. I mean, nobody in the world speaks Java, right? I mean, have you ever been on a trip that people speak Java in a country, right?
Yeah, we're all very global.
Yeah. So there are lots of really important issues going on that I think often, because of changes in the media and newspapers, that people just aren't even aware of anymore. And these are all happening in real time, and I think it's part of the reason why these conversations are important, and it's why I think the business community leaning in on talent and on a P20, the pipeline and our systems around preparing talent and around equitable systems is so important.
Yeah, I think you all answered my question without even asking. I was going to ask about the most important levers to pull, and what I heard was work-based learning opportunities, a truth-telling culture, the employer's role in the talent development side, recognizing the uncertainty of the labor market and not creating the system to produce exactly what we need today, and holding that high bar for all students, so that we don't just, so we're not just a panel of brilliant people saying really smart things. What would you, and this will be the last question I ask, what is the one call to action that you would make of the people in this room? How do we go beyond talking about what is needed, and what are some tangible examples of things that we can do to help Detroit Drives Degrees reach 60% by 2025, Bill?
I like this notion of personal heroism alone won't help you succeed, or at what cost. And there are simple mentoring programs that we could do, and I think that that's that support system in place. I think that we can do a lot more. They show up at GM on their first day of work, so we hire 2,500 college students a year in the United States alone. They show up their first day of work, and they may have had internships and stuff, but they're deer in a headlight. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of sad that they feel a little bit traumatized, because like, oh my God, I'm in the corporate world. How do I behave? How do I dress? What can I say? So it really shouldn't be that way. We should back up and kind of inoculate them, and also help them on some of this so-called soft skills, building around resilience and how to navigate your careers, and because it's going to be a tumultuous ride for them. They're going to stay in their jobs probably 3 years, and do the math. If you work, say, 30 years, that's 10 companies you might be working in. So how do we help them be adaptable to change, navigate the situation, resilience? But that alone won't guarantee their success. How to construct and build a social support system beyond just hiding behind Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and cutesy photos and pictures and look at me, to real social support, and how that everybody feels like they need a mentor, but they really don't know how to use a mentor. So we're doing a lot within GM to say, mentoring programs, and how do we help you with the mechanics of managing your career. But I'd love for all of us to, we can easily do some pragmatic things to start more robust mentoring programs and things, not waiting. Corporate leaders can get more involved and mentor people. And there already is infrastructure in the community to do that, but I just don't know if we really put our weight behind it. That's my hunch anyway.
That's great. Amber, a call to action.
We're thinking a lot about how you build a movement for educational equity and excellence in a state that's now 49th for some of the most important indicators for learning in the country, such as third grade reading. And 10 years ago, we were about average in the country. We're now in the bottom 5 states or bottom 10 states for most indicators. So we're thinking about that institutionally, and with a lot of conversations with other partners, including the Detroit Regional Chamber, and I think through institutions that you're part of, supporting and encouraging and getting involved in their educational initiatives, obviously really important. We're also thinking a lot about what our longer term plans are. I wish I could tell you that, but those plans are being hatched now in conversation with lots of other organizations in the state, including philanthropy, which you talked about being so important. But in the short term, I think being an advocate and you know, being one of the voices that is pushing for urgency and excellence and equity in the systems that we know are really important. You can go to our website, www.edtrustmidwest.org, if you want to sign up for not only our newsletter, but also just to keep you abreast of what is happening at the state level and in the big system level, changes that are going on in the state and those policy debates. And in ways that you can get involved, in ways that you can have a voice. You know, we'd love to get you involved somehow.
Thanks. And David, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, in addition to these ideas, I'll add something else that I think is important, and particularly I think for people who are in this room and our host today, is to make sure that the data and information about the requirements for success in this rapidly accelerating world are very clear to people who are shaping the programs in the educational pipeline, and in addition, very clear and transparent to young people who are growing up in experiential isolation. I just think that this gap, this enormous gap between the world that well-positioned, privileged people see and that disadvantaged people don't see, has got to be bridged. And I think that can begin with transparency about where is the world headed. That should not be private information. That should be public conversation. And then grounding that, I think, in rich opportunities for particularly young people who grow up in isolation to experience through work-based learning these opportunities of what the world is like. Because I believe when young people see what is emerging and what is possible, they will gravitate to prepare for it. And that's my assumption. And so we have to make possible the information and the pathways for that to happen.
Well, thank you very much. That was so insightful. Please join me in thanking the panelists.